The world could soon face food shortages of biblical proportions within the next few months. That dire warning coming from the United Nations Food Agency, who point to COVID-19 as a major part in the global problem. Here's RT's Alex Mihailovich with a closer look at the impact being felt in North America.
It was not the news that world leaders wanted to hear.
At the same time, while we're dealing with COVID-19 pandemic.
Addressing the UN Security Council, the executive director of the World Food Program, David Beasley, made it clear 135 million people around the world are headed towards starvation, with the coronavirus potentially taking an additional 130 million down that path.
In a worst-case scenario, we could be looking at famine in about 36 countries. And in fact, 10 of these countries, we already have more than 1 million people per country who are on the verge of starvation.
In a number of nations that already have difficulty feeding their people, it's not only COVID-19 that is making things worse, but also locusts. From Africa to South Asia, swarms of the destructive insects are disseminating crops. Millions of acres of vegetation have been left barren by the bugs in 23 countries. It is thought that the current locust population could grow up to 400 times its current number by summer, potentially spreading to new areas. Add that to the strains of COVID-19, things do not look good for these already hurting nations. In other parts of the world, the question many are asking is, can COVID-19 affect food supplies in highly developed countries like Canada and the U.S.? This is what the U.S. Secretary of Agriculture had to say last week.
It's COVID-19 is impacting food processing facilities, as you know. For Americans who may be worried about access to good food because of this, I want to assure you the American food supply is strong, resilient, and safe.
This week, however, things don't seem quite as certain. Work in at least 7 major U.S. meat plants has been halted. This week in Iowa, a Tyson Foods pork processing plant that employs 2,800 workers was closed after at least 180 of its employees tested positive for COVID-19. Approximately 20,000 pigs a day are handled at the Iowa location, and combined with a Tyson plant that has shut down in Indiana, together they account for about 18% of the U.S.'s hog slaughtering capacity. A USA Today investigation found that 150 of the nation's largest meat processing plants, which includes pork, poultry, and beef, are in counties where the virus is spiking. When it comes to beef, the USDA has said that production is down 19% from last year at this time, meaning that there will be less beef and that it will be more expensive. Adding to the problem, 2 out of 3 of Canada's biggest beef processing plants are suffering from COVID-19 outbreaks. When combined, the 3 facilities push out 95% of all of Canada's beef. The country is looking at cutting exports of meat to the U.S. to boost its own supply. The UN says, while time is running out, if we put our minds together and act immediately, a global catastrophe can be avoided. For RT, I'm Alex Mihailovich.
And the UN is also saying the looming hunger pandemic will bring the worst humanitarian crisis since World War II. Now, even before the coronavirus pandemic, 821 million people around the world were already experiencing chronic hunger, with another 135 million on the brink of starvation. So here to discuss is the editor of Pan-African News, Abayomi Azikiwe. Abayomi, always good to see you. So the IMF warned last week that the global economy was likely to be hit as hard as the Great Depression, that the global growth would contract by 3% this year, blaming it on the coronavirus. Can you expand on this for us and who you think will be most impacted by this?
Well, of course, it will be working people. It will be people from oppressed nations and nationalities, particularly in the United States and Canada. We already see the impact of it. 26 million people have filed for unemployment compensation in the United States over the last 5 weeks. Those are the people who were able to get through on their computers or on their telephones. Many others have not been able to reach the unemployment offices to file their claims. Some have been able to file their claims but they have not been able to certify their claims and therefore have not received any funds for over a month right now. So yes, this is a serious problem. And as you mentioned before, with the outbreak of coronavirus disease in the meat production industry, it portends much for developments over the next few weeks and the next few months in the United States and indeed worldwide.
And also, speaking of that era, the experts also say this will be the worst humanitarian crisis since World War II, with the number of people starving expected to double. So how can this huge dramatic rise be explained? And is there any way to flatten that curve?
Well, there are other variables involved in the food insecurity issue. First of all, we've had tremendous instability in certain geopolitical regions of the world. If we look at the southern Arabian Peninsula, where a lot of many scientists say the locust infestations are originating from there that have spread to of Africa and East Africa. We also have to look at the question of global warming, the impact of flooding, disproportionate rain, and this, of course, contributes to the infestation of locusts. Also, with the economic crisis that has been thrust upon us right now in the West as well as in the other regions of the world, that, of course, too, will limit demand as well as supply because the corporations that control the international food industry will not produce unless they're guaranteed of making a profit. So we have in the United States right now tremendous amounts of fruit, milk, and other produce and non-perishable perishable items and non-perishables that are being destroyed because the markets do not exist in the restaurants, in the schools, in the universities, and other institutions which have been closed as a result of the COVID-19 pandemic. So it's a real crisis of both supply and demand.
Absolutely. I mean, there's obviously problems we're experiencing currently with an artificial shortage here in America, and we haven't even been hit the hardest just yet. And Abayomi, the World Food Program names Yemen, Venezuela, South Sudan, and Nigeria as the countries they expect to also be hit the hardest. But food insecurity isn't really far away. It's not a far away story like in Africa being, hit by locusts, which I would presume is a natural occurrence. It's happening right here in the U.S. even prior to coronavirus. But the pandemic is also going to intensify hunger here. So where do you see this going, and how do we solve that? We've seen photos of dairy farmers having to dump the milk down the drains. What is happening with the supply chain?
Well, we live in a capitalist system, and the motivation of those who control the means of production is the maximization of profit. So that's why their first instinct is to lay people off. As opposed to providing incentives for people to maintain their jobs. It is a question of who actually controls the food supply. And it's a agribusiness interests that control the food supply worldwide. Even in Africa, for example, when you have cash crop production, as you do have in Kenya and other countries, the production largely depends upon the demand, and a lot of demand is not necessarily domestic, but also internationally. So if the demand in the United States or Canada or other Western countries decline as a result of joblessness, as a result of the dislocation of people, even in the West, because if people can't pay rents, they can't pay their mortgages, we're going to have a huge spike in homelessness here in the West as well. Then there won't be any motivation for farmers, both domestically, meaning the United States, as well as internationally, to produce for export. So it's a very vicious cycle that we're entering right now. But what needs to take place is greater international cooperation. And we're not saying that coming from the administration in Washington. For example, last week, with the suspension of funding to the World Health Organization. This could not come at a worse time because right now what we need is cooperation between countries all over the world to address the COVID-19 pandemic.
Yeah, it doesn't look like that's happening, and certainly not anytime soon. We got to leave it right there. Abayomi Azikiwe of Pan African News, always appreciate your insight. Thank you.
Thank you for inviting me.